Thank you, Michael. You know, Unitarian Universalism doesn't really care whether you're an atheist, a theist, an agnostic, a Buddhist, a pagan, or a Barnes and Nobleite. In these pluralistic times we live in, there are members in each of those categories and many, many more. Our faith tradition does care very much of how these beliefs translate into how we treat each other, how we treat ourselves. And that is one of the beauties of this faith of ours. Do we connect with ourselves? Do we connect with life? Do we connect with others? Well, good morning to you all. My name is Annie Lavin, and I am your service leader this morning. Perhaps you're joining us this morning seeking community, seeing a familiar face. Perhaps there's been a recent joy or sorrow in your life. Perhaps you're wanting to feel that connection with someone, some idea, some truth that today's service will open your mind and heart to. Whatever your reasons, we welcome you this morning. This morning, we are very pleased to welcome Reverend Libby Smith to our pulpit. Reverend Libby Smith attended Harvard Divinity School and was ordained in 1992. She has served congregations in Pennsylvania and Massachusetts and spent 5 years as chaplain to residents at a UU house, which until recently served those in the Germantown section of Philadelphia. Now retired from congregational service, she does occasional adjunct work for the Central East region of the UUA. And she enjoys the chance to do pulpit supply as she's doing this morning, and we're grateful for her. Her sermon is entitled, In Praise of Bewilderment. It addresses living in this pluralistic society of ours and being humble and open to what we know and what we don't know, while keeping open to the thoughts and the beliefs of others who are very different from our own, and we look forward to that. Gratitude to our musician and accompanist, Michael Casey, and the tech team and the hostess and the greeters, everyone who contributed to today's service, and your names are in the order of service. For announcements, the worship committee is asking you to please consider leading a summer discussion session this year beginning June the 2nd through September 1st. Come share your ideas and your interests with us. Sign up on the whiteboard. It's really a great experience. You just come in with your ideas, and we being UUs and we love to talk, everyone joins right in. So it's an easy and a wonderful thing to do. We need coffee hosts, we need greeters. So please sign up again on the whiteboard. And a reminder that after service today, and in fact in 2 weeks too, so it's today and on April 28th, we're going to have a Doris Scott Legacy Listening program for those who want to know about Doris's bequeathal and how the committee is working on that, and they're presenting it to the congregation so we can move along with that. So stay after church today, have coffee, and then join us in here or on the 28th. And now let us begin. We'll do the chalice lighting. The words are in your order of service, and Reverend Libby will lead us, and I will light the chalice.
Let's read together as Annie lights our chalice this morning. We unite in our differences in background and belief. We unite with hope for a world that honors differences. As we seek answers to our heart's deepest questions, may our own heart be open to unexpected answers. May the light of our chalice remind us that it is a community of warmth, wisdom, and welcoming of multiple truths. And let's join together in singing our opening hymn, number 38 in the gray hymnal, Morning Has Broken. 3 verses? 3 verses.
What? I'm asking.
Opening words. Our lives are inextricably bound up with the lives of others, even if we choose not to see the threads. Being part of a covenantal faith acknowledges those threads, and then it asks the questions. Given that we are connected, given that we share a future, a planet, a world, then how shall we treat each other? How shall we live? These are words from a former UUA president, Reverend Frederick Gray. You know, a month ago, in a Sunday service on pluralism and interdependence, I shared Henry Nouwen's words on inviting the stranger into our lives. I'm sure you will remember that. He's a wonderful Dutch theologian, and he says, the stranger may present in our lives as a person, a thought, a belief, a political position. Doesn't matter. What does matter is that the stranger is often, if not always, outside our comfort zone, not supporting our ideas and notions, thinking differently, not in sync with our truth, you know, the one that's the right one. Today's service continues that idea of making room for the other in a growing pluralistic society where there are so many voices, new ideas, new takes on old truths and new ones too, that will challenge our thinking. Reverend Richard Rohr reminds us that a viewpoint, even ours, is nothing more than a view from a point, a narrow keyhole. And he urges us to be open to ideas, those ideas that often challenge our biases as they cross the boundaries of age and culture and individual experience. And now, in your order of service, you'll see the reading, Breathe with Me, and it's a unison reading, so we can do it, of course, together. And when you're ready, everyone have the insert, begins, breathe with me. Each breath we take in molecules of air that are breathed by every person who has ever lived. Breathe with me and breathe the breath of Jesus, of Moses, of Mohammed, of the Buddha, of those we love, of those we don't, of those sitting by our side in this moment. Through us all. Breathe with me. Connection. Our work here may be blessed. Amen. And now we have acknowledgments of the heart. That time in the service when we light a candle for joys or concerns, whatever weighs on our heart, whatever we want to celebrate. Building community, we strengthen our knowledge of each other. So I will light the first candle. And this is for all the affairs in the world, but especially for the UN Council that is meeting today to discuss the trouble with Iraq and Israel. And may they be blessed with wisdom, as well as our president and all the decisions that are going to be in the next couple of days especially. And now, does someone have a joy or concern that they would like to share?
Good morning. This past week, I had the pleasure of driving 10 hours to Erie, Pennsylvania, where I got to see I sort of got to see the totality of the eclipse. It clouded up a wee bit, but there was a big ray coming out from where the sun was, and the horizon turned orange with like a sunset. So it was still pretty spectacular. And then I got to drive 10 hours back. So if next week I am exhibiting a particular glow. It's not because I've experienced something profound. I'm going to be starting radiation for prostate cancer on Monday. Prognosis is good, I'm not worried, but it's a process, and I will do it. So see you next Sunday.
Well, I'm going to light this candle for my sweet husband, Jimmy, who has a birthday coming up. And we had his wonderful Lavin family with us, and Mary Beth Byers, Lavin Byers, is with us this morning with Jim, so hopefully you'll have a chance to meet her over coffee. And there's so many things to be grateful for, but then I looked in the reflections and I saw all the people who have birthdays this month, including Kim and Liz and Amy and John and Tom and Stan and Amy. Did I say Amy? And I hope I'm not forgetting anybody, but this is for them as well. So blessings to you all in this birthday month. And then the final candle will be for those joys and the concerns that remain in your heart. Blessed be. I will now pass the basket for the offering for this church and its mission. Thank you, Michael. I'm sure those of a certain age recognize that, which bothered and bewildered, and of course it ties in with our sermon, and he does this every week. He will find music that relates, so thank you for that. And now, let me invite you into a time of reflection, a time to relax, settle in your seat, slow your breathing, let go of any worries or concerns, because they'll be here when you come back to us. But for now, to open your mind and heart to the words of Pablo Neruda, who wrote the poem, Die Slowly. He actually received the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1971, and he's warning us about being slaves of habit and to be open to the awe and the wonder of life. Die slowly. He who becomes the slave of habit, whose thinking is limited and harnessed by fear, who follows the same routes every day, who never changes pace, who relies on the familiar, who does not risk and try new ways of thinking and being in this world, who does not speak his truth and intimately experience his unique humanity. He dies slowly. He or she who does not take the risk of discomfort of being out of step with others, who does not risk certainty for uncertainty, who finds not grace in himself and his fellow men, or does not follow a dream or create a new one, he dies slowly. Let us try and avoid death in small doses by reminding ourselves that being alive requires an effort far greater than the simple act of breathing. Let us not waste a moment of this one wild and precious life, as the poet says, and keep open to the awe and the wonder of life, the many choices we have to live it well, and the gift of those who are with us on the journey. Let us take a moment to be with those words. Blessed be. And now I invite Reverend Libby. She will be giving us a reading and her sermon, and entitled, first of all, there's a reading, Why I Am an Agnostic, which is pretty wonderful, and then In Praise of Bewilderment. So Reverend Libby, it's all yours.
You know, sometimes I'm lucky enough to get into a service environment like this where the words that have been chosen by the lay leader and the music that has been chosen by the musician weave themselves together into something that feels so relevant and complete that what I bring ends up feeling almost superfluous. But since I came all the way down from Pennsylvania, I'll go ahead and preach it anyway. And maybe there will be something that gets added to what we've already heard. I want to begin with a reading from the great agnostic, Robert Ingersoll. Let us be honest with ourselves. In the presence of countless mysteries, standing beneath the boundless heaven sown thick with constellations, knowing that each grain of sand, each leaf, each blade of grass asks of every mind the answerless question. Knowing that the simplest thing defies solution. Feeling that we deal with the superficial and the relative, and that we are forever eluded by the real, the absolute. Let us admit the limitations of our minds. And let us have the courage and the candor to say, we do not know. Well, it is a great pleasure to be with all of you this morning in person, after one visit was postponed due to the pandemic and another wound up being a virtual visit. So I'm delighted finally to be here, to meet you for real, especially Annie, with whom I've had so many wonderful email conversations over the years now, and to explore this beautiful part of the world that you all call home. So thank you for welcoming me this morning. At the same time, I need to acknowledge that I'm a little bit ambivalent about being here for a couple of reasons. Not ambivalent about meeting all of you. One of the great pleasures of being mostly retired is having the luxury of doing guest preaching and meeting so many different people in different congregations around the area. We differ in so many ways, and yet there's always an immediate sense of familiarity and connection and community. And that's particularly meaningful to me now, because that feeling of community, for me at least, and I'm guessing for many of you, took a real hit over the last 4 years. And I'm still feeling the effect of all of that isolation. Of course, that varied a lot from person to person. Our experiences may have been very different. Some folks had jobs that meant they had to keep showing up even if they would have preferred to stay home and stay safe. Some chose to take more risks than others, choosing connection over caution. But all of us experienced, to different degrees, a changed rhythm to our lives, reduced options, and limited connections. And now we have largely found our way back to what we think of as normal life. And for some, that has been easy and joyful. For others, it may have been a little harder than we expected, which brings me back to my ambivalence, because as much as I am delighted to meet all of you and be part of this community this morning, I'm also still a little edgy about being in groups in enclosed spaces for any length of time. And I'm painfully aware that that's now quite a minority position to hold. We've all had different responses to the shift back to normal life. Some folks were done with the pandemic really quickly. They threw away their masks and started dining out and doing karaoke in crowded bars. And some folks took it a lot more slowly. Some people are still doing risk assessment around each potential activity. And some are still mostly staying at home, avoiding all but necessary contacts. My point being simply that we're not all in the same place on this. Now, because of some immune issues in our household, I am still rocking my N95s pretty much any time I go indoors in a crowded space. But increasingly, I am the only person wearing a mask, and I've started to get some looks. Maybe some of you have had those looks in certain situations, an eye roll here or there. The message seems to be that if other people are done with the pandemic, I should be done with the pandemic too. And I find myself feeling a little defensive, wanting to stop them and justify wearing a mask, say, look, this is not a political statement. This is about my immune-compromised family members. Please try to understand. But noticing those reactions has helped me to realize something. And that, I think the pandemic really highlighted this, but it didn't create it. It just made me much more aware of it. Our tendency to very quickly pigeonhole each other on the basis of very limited information. I think we've been this way as a culture for a long time, but it became much more obvious in recent years, and especially around the masking issue. We've gotten so good at snap judgments, and small symbols become huge indicators of which side someone is on. Mask or no mask. American flag on the back of the pickup truck. Hate has no home here sign in the front yard. Black Lives Matter lapel pin. Or the one I saw recently that I'm still trying to figure out that said, gun rights are women's rights. Maybe so, but I'm not sure what that means. But we take one look at some small thing and we think we know everything we need to know about another person. Now, one of my guilty secrets, because UU ministers are supposed to be profound and we're supposed to always be reading deep material. Well, in our household, it's my husband who reads the deep material. And I sit around reading mysteries and watching detective series on television, which I will admit he also does. And one of the reasons I love those things is that it's usually really easy to know who the good guys are and who the bad guys are, to know which side to be on. And in most of the ones that I read and watch, you can be reasonably sure that eventually the good guys are going to prevail. And that kind of certainty is really comforting. The sense of knowing the answers, knowing what's right and what's wrong, and knowing that I'm on the right side. But that's fiction. And in real life, the answers are usually much more complicated and nuanced than we want to acknowledge, at least than I want to acknowledge. And so our work is to get beneath the code words and symbols that seem to tell us so much about each other and look for the deeper truths of who we really are. I stumbled across an article last year that lifts up what a deep and urgent need this deeper exploration is in our larger culture right now, and offers up a strategy for how to go about the hard work of going deeper. The article was in the Hedgehog Review, and it's by Alan Levinovitz. He's a professor in the Philosophy and Religion department at James Madison University. And it caught my eye first mainly because of the title, In Praise of Bewilderment. And my first reaction was, at last, someone is affirming my natural state, because I spend so much of my life feeling bewildered. So it was wonderful to hear Bewitched, Bothered, and Bewildered during the offertory. I heard him practicing, warming up as I came in. I said, oh, are you going to use that this morning? That's so perfect. Levinovitz begins by saying, there is hope for America's ailing soul. It draws on a standard teaching technique familiar to anyone reading these words, bewilderment. And then he goes on to describe the way that he leads his students to question their assumptions and to recognize the complexity of the issues that they're studying. They start out certain, for example, that science and religion are utterly incompatible ways of knowing the world. You either look at the world through a scientific lens or a religious lens. You can't do both. They're certain of this. But he says, when someone is certain, it's very hard to learn. So, he says, I begin with bewilderment. Are you familiar with Gregor Mendel, the 19th century Roman Catholic friar whose mathematical acumen and love of biology gave us the earliest known laws of genetic heredity? Did you know Sir Isaac Newton wrote much more about religion and astrology, no, not astronomy, astrology, than physics? Maybe you find history dull, then consider Dr. Francis Collins, former director of the National Institutes of Health, leader of the Human Genome Project, and avowed evangelical Christian. He finds that his students at first resist this kind of exploration. They argue back, but he meets their arguments with counter-arguments until they're deep into the complexities of the interplay between science and religion. And he says, and I quote, eventually, if we're lucky, we achieve bewilderment. Fine, what is the relationship between religion and science? And there, in the space created by uncertainty and ambiguity, learning can begin. That space is humble, open, flexible. My students discover that I'm right there in it with them. I don't have the answers either. We work together, think things through, and as in any good class, we emerge changed, not validated. I want to repeat a little of that. In the space created by uncertainty and ambiguity, learning can begin. That space is humble, open, flexible. We emerge changed, not validated. And that leads me directly to the other reason that I'm ambivalent about preaching this sermon to you this morning, because I am preaching yet another sermon about something that I think is vitally important that I rarely manage to put into practice. And I think the hardest thing for me about writing sermons is the way that I'm constantly reminded of this great chasm between the person who I am and the person who I think I ought to be. I am often not willing to enter that space of ambiguity that Levinovitz talks about, where learning can take place. If I'm really honest, I'm more interested in having other people recognize the validity of where I'm coming from, to recognize that I'm right. Because if everybody would just realize that I was right and do things the way I thought we should do them, everything would be fine. But as Levinovitz points out, that makes it very hard for me to learn anything. Now, the illustration that Levinovitz used about science and religion and the interplay between them was especially helpful to me and led to my choice for this morning's reading. Robert Ingersoll was an American lawyer and writer and orator in the mid to late 1800s, who was known as the Great Agnostic and who wrote volumes defending and extolling the agnostic worldview. I discovered Ingersoll when I was in college, and I devoured his writing. I still have pages and pages of things I copied out of these great tomes of collected writing from the library in college. I was really moved by his ability to claim the power of mystery and awe without also claiming any kind of religious belief. He felt that those could be teased apart. Now, his views were far more radical in his day, of course, than they are today. In fact, it was a big, long heresy trial, the transcripts of his heresy trial that I was copying a lot of this from back in the day when I stumbled across his writing in the early 1980s. But I felt at the time so validated by his vehemence because I was a pretty rabid Unitarian atheist, convinced that I could be an atheist and be religious as a Unitarian and that there was no conflict between these. And when I came to that phrase, let us have the courage and the candor to say, we do not know, that was just music to a young, defiant Unitarian's ears. Over time, though, I came to hear the echoes of arrogance in some of his words. This implication that we are the courageous ones. We have the courage and the candor to say we do not know. The rest of you are too timid and dishonest to admit that you don't know, and so you cling instead to your ridiculous belief systems. That's kind of the subtext that I hear in Ingersoll. Maybe he didn't mean it that way. I like to think he didn't. But even taking that into account, for me as a young adult, he opened a door that allowed me to claim my commitment to rationalism while also claiming the beauty and the wonder of the world, about which he wrote a great deal. He believed in awe. He just had differences of opinion with a lot of religious people about the source of that awe. So perhaps he served as in a way, as a bridge for me between science and religion. But I wanted to use his words for another reason as well, going back to that undertone of arrogance, a cautionary reason, because I am often struck by the way that we Unitarian Universalists, who put such an emphasis on being willing to admit we don't know when it comes to theology, tend to be extremely certain that we do know when it comes to everything else. We've done it consistently even within our own movement. In fact, often within our own movement, we have done this with theology, arguing about the right way not to know. The early Unitarians completely ostracized the Transcendentalists when they began to emerge out of the movement because they were taking it in the wrong direction. We had a long stretch where the humanists and the theists were duking it out at every General Assembly over who had the right to be here in our movement. That hasn't completely gone away. UU Christians still feel significantly marginalized. Now that my actual church membership is with a small Mennonite congregation, I get some interesting looks from Unitarians when I mention that from the pulpit. And we do the same thing with social issues. We dig in our heels not only about the right causes to embrace, but also about the specific methodology that must be used to do the work of those causes. We don't seem to have much capacity for bewilderment because we're always so sure that we're right. So Levinovitz starts his article by affirming that bewilderment provides hope for America's ailing soul. That's a big statement. Clearly, he believes we need to bring this kind of openness and humility into public dialogue of all kinds. He acknowledges that it's hard and that it's scary to move into that state of bewilderment, to be less sure that we know what we think we know. But, he argues, the resulting worldview is more useful and more beautiful because it genuinely reflects reality. That's why a synonym for bewilderment is wonder, which, at least for me, he says, is not terrifying, but exhilarating. I like wonder as a synonym for bewilderment. My sister told me years ago that when she comes up against someone whose opinion is uncomfortably different from her own, she tries to approach them with an attitude of witness and wonder. Witness, pay attention in a serious way to what the person is saying, doing, thinking. And then wonder. Try to imagine where those thoughts and ideas might be coming from, what experiences that person might have had, why they feel the way they do. Trying to understand doesn't necessarily mean we end up agreeing. And Levinovitz is definitely not saying that we should always agree. He says clearly, allowing bewilderment to infuse our approach to an issue does not mean we cannot have strong beliefs. We will still have differences of opinion, big differences of opinion on all kinds of issues. We'll still need to take stands. But he argues, if we can bring some of that sense of bewilderment into a conversation with someone who disagrees with us, quote, the conversation turns into a dialogue instead of an argument. We make progress instead of war. Now, Levinovitz is talking about big issues, religion and science, abortion, politics at every level. He sees us as a nation heading in the wrong direction, toward more and more certainty and rigidity on both sides, either side of every issue. And he argues that we can buck that trend if we're willing to cultivate bewilderment in ourselves, and then by our own example, encourage its cultivation in others. Now, I find this a big ask, because so often I assume that the person on the other side is not going to meet me in that vulnerable space. Maybe I'll go there, and they won't join me. It feels risky to cede any ground at all to those people and their ideas. I feel under threat, and so I dig in my heels and I defend my side as the right side. But then I look around our country and I think, how is that working for us, really? Levinovitz uses the metaphor of spandex to illustrate the way that bewilderment functions in public dialogue. Think about how clothing is more flexible and resilient, able to accommodate different shapes when you add a little spandex. As he points out, you can still squat without ripping your pants. That's how bewilderment benefits culture. He says the fabric of our society is increasingly inflexible, brittle, fragile. Our rigid ideologies are ready to crack under the slightest pressure. But this is a democracy, and we can fight against the inertia of tyrannical certainty, one person at a time. We can cultivate bewilderment in ourselves, and by our example, encourage its cultivation in others. We can admit with the relief of honesty that some questions are genuinely difficult. We can reject the rigid binaries forced upon us by a sense of crisis. And we can recognize that our resistance to doing so isn't in the service of making progress, but rather a way of protecting ourselves. And he ends by saying, I have hope for our collective soul, which, if we have the courage, can stretch and change rather than tearing itself apart. Well, I would certainly rather see us stretch and change than tear ourselves apart. And if it feels too daunting to jump right into this discipline of bewilderment when facing the great chasms of our culture, the good news is that there's plenty of room to practice it right here at home. In my experience, it's hard enough to cultivate that attitude of witness and wonder, even among the people I'm closest to, the ones I respect and appreciate and value. Even in a community like this one, where you define yourselves by your common values, we still contain a wide range of experiences and opinions, whether it's where we are on pandemic precautions or personal theology or a variety of social or political issues, we have plenty of differences among us. And even in our congregations, we can be quick to take sides and judge each other and assume that we know the best way to go about whatever it is we're trying to do. So if there's any hope of our learning to enter a state of bewilderment with folks who are very, very different from us, I think it lies in our learning right here to witness and wonder, to meet differences with curiosity rather than judgment, to be less sure that we know the definitive answer, and more convinced that we can get to that answer together if we listen across those divides. So I invite you to join me in search of and in praise of bewilderment. Let us, at least sometimes, have the courage and the candor to say, we do not know, and really mean it. And then maybe we can begin to learn.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Reverend Libby. And Betty will pass the mic now for a few moments. I'm sure you've got some thoughts on the stage of bewilderment. So pertinent. So we won't have too much time, but we'll have enough to get some thoughts. So, does anyone have a thought? You have a nice short thought, Harry?
Well, this goes right along with the recent experience. 1 year ago, I was absolutely sure as an atheist that there's no such thing as a spirit world. There's no thought process up without the physical brain. And then I took a course on near-death experience. And I can maybe explain a little bit, but I must admit that there is a possibility, even in Harry Hart's brain, that there may be such a thing as a spiritual beings and spiritual worlds. I have to open up just a little bit to that.
Thank you. Anyone else? Bewilderment. Oh, Johnny.
This is sort of peripheral, but one of the things I've heard a lot from people in the congregation is confusion and uncomfortableness about pronouns. And it's hard for us of a certain generation to describe or to think of someone, a singular person, an individual, as plural. And it just, I don't know, why that's that important, but there is a uncertainty there. So you have any thoughts on that?
Reverend Libby, if you want to stand up, that's great. Love to have that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great example. And I don't have any particular wisdom to offer on it except to thank you for raising it, because I remember my mother telling me once, when I was talking about gay rights back in the 80s, and she was uncomfortable, but she said, I think it's the job of each generation to push beyond where their parents were able to go. And it does mean encountering things that we don't fully understand. We don't necessarily even understand why they're important or how they're even possible. And yet we recognize how much power they have for other people. And so we try to find our way into some level of openness and comfort. But it's hard. In my little Mennonite church, we made a commitment to be fully open and affirming to the LGBTQ community. That is not a typical stance among Mennonites. And there were a few people in the congregation who were very uncomfortable, and they voiced their discomfort and said, I'm very uncomfortable with this, and I recognize that it's what we should do. And I think being willing to move forward, even in the midst of discomfort, is much harder. I wrote to that person and thanked them, because that's much harder to do than if, it's easy. It was easy for me coming in as a UU to say, of course we should do this. Came naturally to me, but I didn't have a lifetime of being told how sinful it was. So, it takes a lot of courage to break through those barriers.
Well, I struggle with in our household because of the 15-year difference between John and I. about the pronouns. So the simplest way I've got my head around it is if you're driving down the road and some fool is driving very erratically and you want to make a comment about it or think about it, but you can't see or tell whether it's a man or a woman, you say, boy, they sure are a bad driver. You got to hand it to them.
The great conservative of England was Edmund Burke. And at the end of his life, he was asked to define just exactly what a conservative is. And his definition was epistemological modesty.
I'm sitting over here lost in thought. Thank you. Anyone else? Okay.
On the they, them, the sibling of two of my nieces, who was my third niece, now prefers to be referred to as they, them. And it's taken her parents, their parents, a while to get used to it. And I wouldn't get hung up on tripping up and referring to people by the wrong pronoun accidentally, as long as you are not doing it maliciously or stubbornly. I know her parents, it's been at least a year, and they're just about getting it right now most of the time. But, right away they said to the siblings, you will address them, they, because it's a matter of respect, just like you call someone by the name that they prefer, not necessarily the name that they were given. And so, just make an effort. And if you trip yourself up and someone catches you, correct yourself.
Thank you. Anyone else? We kind of got off on the topic of the they, thems, but I just love the idea of the awe, just to be in awe of everything. Love it.
I guess I've had an issue over the last 10 years taking undoing racism classes and so forth. I've seen how my thoughts have changed, but I cannot understand the backlash. The people who are anti-woke, I'm afraid I could not look at them with awe and wonder. They're wrong.
Did you want to say something? Oh, I thought I saw your hand. Anyone else? Oh, Nancy.
I liked what you said, Reverend Libby, about paying attention, being witness when people say things that, perhaps I don't agree with, but to witness and try to put myself in their shoes. And the closest, because I have good friends who have totally different political beliefs, and we just sort of don't go there. But I know they're good people in so many ways. And I think, like Bob, what you were saying, to me, what helps me is that I think a lot of people that are like the anti-woke and all, I think so much of that comes from a place of fear. And it must be hard to live with that fear. So I try, but it's like you said, it's not easy. Thank you for your sermon.
It was a wonderful sermon, so thank you so much. We'll have our second and last hymn right now. It's 298, Wake Now My Senses, 298. We love it when our speakers have beautiful voices, too. Really helps the choir. So for closing words, so how do you think we're going to leave this congregation this morning and go out into the world without judging others and hopefully entering into a space, an open space for ideas and true dialogue and the promise of being able to hear each other's truth? It may or may not change our thinking, and that's not the point, but it will expand our hearts. And remember always the words of Rumi, our 13th century mystic poet, who says, "Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there's a field. I'll meet you there." And now I will extinguish the chalice. The words are in your order of service. We extinguish this flame. These we carry in our hearts until we meet again. And the postlude. Thank you. It was wonderful. So our thanks to Reverend Libby and to Michael and to each of you helping to create today's service. And I'll leave you with this prayer that if you believe in God, may God go with you. For those who love life, may life return the affection. And for those who are seeking the true path, may the path be found and the grace to take it every day. And now please join us for coffee and conversation and have a wonderful week.